Hi, everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with my co host Thomas D. Howes for another episode of the Reagan Caucus podcast. Our guest today is a professor of history at the University of Alabama and a senior research fellow at the Independence Institute. He's also an author of multiple historical books, including a brand new one about President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's called FDR, A New Political Life. I have a copy of it here for those watching us on YouTube. I'm talking, of course, I should have introduced him first, David T. Beito. David, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus podcast.
Well, thanks for letting me come on.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're excited to have you on. Now, David, this probably won't surprise you a whole lot, but we've talked about Ronald Reagan a lot on this podcast, but we haven't talked a whole lot about FDR. You know, Roosevelt is, of course, I would say, fair to say, one of our most iconic presidents. He was in office during a very complex time in our nation's history, and he made some very consequential decisions. Many Americans, including my mom, by the way, think of him as our greatest U.S. president ever. But you, David, have illuminated FDR's presidency in a way that doesn't exactly line up with the glowing picture that my mom and others have of him. Can you talk about the research you put into this book and some of the big conclusions you came away with, David, when you were studying FDR's time in office?
Well, my parents would probably get along well with your mom because they revered FDR along with Hubert Humphrey. They were about co-equal figures in our house in reverence. I think that FDR's record during the 1930s was not anything to brag about. In fact, I often say that if FDR had not run for re-election in 1940, how would historians now assess him? If you looked at what the situation was in the 1940 election, you had unemployment was still in double digits. So that was 10 years of depression, the longest in American history. We were still stuck in it. In terms of civil rights, it was very, very poor record. Anti-lynching bills had been repeatedly proposed in Congress. They had no support from the administration. They never went anywhere. Civil rights legislation never went anywhere. No efforts were made to save, very little in the way of an effort to save European Jews by lifting immigration bars or finding places for them to immigrate outside of the U.S. So very little to brag about. So I think that that's one interesting way that you can look at this. If you want to look at FDR's record, that it's not a sterling record of a great president. FDR is usually ranked, as you said, as one of the greats. He's number one, number two, sometimes number three, but he's way up there. However, if you look at these presidential rankings, they do have a tendency to change over time. It was not so many years ago that Woodrow Wilson was ranked in the top 5, certainly top 10 presidents, but now he's slipped quite a bit in the last few years. So I think Americans want their heroes, but I think FDR is a hero that has a lot of flaws, a lot of serious flaws. And of course, if we look at his civil liberties record is arguably the worst of any president in American history. So my biography is not a very sympathetic treatment of FDR. I think it's fair to say. And FDR as a person as well as FDR as a policymaker. And I was once thinking of making the title of my book, The Coldest Man. I was dissuaded from doing that because it's not, it wouldn't come across, I don't know, very scholarly. However, that's a quotation from Harry Truman. Harry Truman was asked about FDR shortly before he died, shortly before Truman died. And he said, well, what do you really think of FDR? And he said, he was the coldest man I ever knew. He didn't care about you. He didn't care about me, but he brought the country into the 20th century. So it's an interesting sort of mixed treatment. Sort of interesting in that way, too, is the biography written by FDR's attorney general. One of his attorney generals, Francis Biddle. Biddle deplored Japanese internment. He didn't think FDR had a good civil liberties record. He fought it. Very negative stuff. But who did he dedicate his biography to? He dedicated his biography to FDR. So it's interesting how there's people have a sort of, I don't know, Jekyll and Hyde view sometimes, even people that were close to FDR. And a lot of my source material is from people that were close there, that were in the room with FDR and what they said about particular incidents, people that were sympathizers in many cases to FDR.
Wow, no, that's interesting stuff, and it's your book uncovers a lot. I want to go ahead and bring Thomas into this. He is I'll admit he is much more historically astute than I am, so I'm sure he'll have some very good questions for you here.
Hi, David. What do you think about the argument? What I've always heard is like the strongest argument for FDR. You know, if you dig into all the civil liberties issues and the regime uncertainty that is interventionism created to, that extended the Depression. With George Selgin, I think, has a book on that. I still haven't I've read parts of it back when he would post chapters on his blog.
Yeah, and I cited quite a bit. George is a very good historian.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, very smart guy. But I always took as the strongest argument for him, besides the war stuff, just giving him some credit for, sort of the radio sort of leadership that he exercised during the war, was just that the 30s were so radical with all these fascist movements and socialist movements and everything going on, that FDR's, bad interventionism was probably the best we were going to get. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that is an argument that's been made by a lot of historians, and FDR himself would say, he would say, well, I saved these guys. I saved the capitalists. What are they complaining about now? So he sort of depicted himself that way. And a lot of people depicted like he saved capitalism. He saved democracy. I don't really buy that argument for a lot of reasons. Let's look at the 1932 election. It was really a kind of status quo election. The FDR in some ways ran to the right of Hoover. In some ways he ran to the left. He was the first triangulator. He promised to cut the budget. In fact, Ronald Reagan once said, I think somewhat disingenuously, he said, well, I didn't change, and then he would quote the 1932 Democratic platform. He said, I could sign into that platform, cutting government spending 25% and all this. In fact, that was one of FDR's earliest speeches we have in audio, is where he goes over the Democratic platform, and he sounds like Reagan. He really does. Mm-hmm. Very interesting speech to listen to. So what is my point here? My point here is that the socialists, the communists, the fascists, they're nowhere to be seen in that election.
Yeah.
Americans, I've bought into the system. Now, there are things like going on disorder. A lot of it's tax revolts. But these do not represent, by and large, a rejection of the status quo. So 1932 is sometimes given the impression that Americans voted for the New Deal, that they were sick and tired of the free market, of whatever, and they voted for a radical big government movement, right? Or an FDR version of big government. No, they didn't, right? So that's quite clear. And the communists were a bust in 1932. The socialists were a bust. So if Americans were really on the verge of some sort of overthrowing the system, where are the signs of it? In fact, you really don't get these insurgent movements, like, if you want to call them that, like Huey Long or Father Coughlin. These movements really don't get rolling till about, really well into FDR's first term, 1935, something like that. So let's assume you had elected that FDR had gone in a different direction. Let's assume that he had carried out the Democratic platform as he said he would, and cut government spending. Let's assume that he would have preserved sound currency. A little vague there, but Hoover talked that way too. Let's assume he kept the gold standard. Let's assume he pursued another way rather than federal deposit insurance, such as imitating the Canadian system of allowing branch banking. he had a tremendous goodwill. He had tremendous support. Americans were willing to sign on to anything. It was a desperate situation. That is true. I would call it a situation of desperation, but more of flux. Americans could have gone in a lot of different directions. So I don't think that FDR was holding the dam against fascism or communism. I don't see that was looming. Where's the evidence of that? I don't, I don't think it's there. So if you're preventing the overthrow of capitalism, what are you preventing? What is the actual thing you're preventing? I don't see it. Not in the U.S. context.
So that's reading the radicalism of the late 30s into the early 30s and treating it like FDR doesn't have any responsibility for allowing that to happen, because he's been president all those years. So that's basically what you're saying. It's like 1932 is where we're going to judge, because he could have taken it in a way to get us out of this issue, and then we wouldn't have had all this radicalism develop, you're saying.
Well, I don't know if I'm saying that so much. I mean, I think that I actually think that there's some truth in that. I guess my broader point was that the argument he made that he was saving capitalism, saving it from what? That assumes that there's a threat to capitalism. There's a threat to the status quo in the U.S. What is it, right? I don't see it. There's certainly people are pissed off and upset, right? They want change. They are dissatisfied with the status quo, but it's more like, it's not sort of a systematic dissatisfaction where they want to overthrow the system, I guess is what I'm saying. They bought into the system, and that makes the U.S. very different from, say, Germany. Arguably, the Depression hit us harder than Germany, but we had these institutions, we had the traditions that were strong enough that, it didn't have the same effect.
Would you at least say that, because the Democratic Party had become dominant because of the dissatisfaction with Hoover, would you say within the Democratic Party of that time there were any viable options that were, would have been better than FDR? Just given how those lopsided those elections were back then.
Well, maybe not, but we don't know what FDR was going to do.
Yeah.
And people at the time didn't do. He had support from the more conservative elements in the party, like Senator Carter Glass. He had support from people like, his vice president, who's fairly conservative, John Nance Garner. He had support of H.L. Mencken, for God's sakes. He had a lot of the conservatives were willing to support FDR. And that was partly because FDR sort of gave them all sorts of signals that was how he's going to govern, but also people on the left saw signals. So he sent mixed messages. Would there have been someone that would? Yeah, I think there probably would have been a lot of people, that would have pursued a much better economic policy. I think if Senator Carter Glass had been president, not the greatest civil rights record, but FDR didn't have the greatest civil rights record either. I think we would have had a much more effective, probably financial policy, more effective response to the Great Depression. Heck, if John Nance Garner had been president, who knows? But there were a lot of politicians in the Democratic Party that were much more conservative, that were into budget cutting, economy and government, sound money. In fact, that was the tradition, the Grover Cleveland Democrats, right? Some of them are still around at that time. That tradition isn't completely dead. It's there.
And what would you say explains then FDR's, besides, his, whenever you're the leader of a major war that was important, like, World War II, you're going to get a big boost in popularity because you're the wartime president. But is there anything besides that where you'd say explains his popularity among intellectuals and also among the general population?
Well, John might want to ask his parents if they agree with this, but my parents were Norwegian American farmers from Western Minnesota. They were, they were ordinary people in terms of their income and all that. But they had this view of They didn't say it about FDR, but they said it about Nelson Rockefeller. And I think it would probably apply to FDR. They were Nelson Rockefeller people. And I thought, well, how can you be your old-time Democrats? And they said, well, he doesn't have to do this, right? He could just live in wealth. He could just enjoy life. But here he is. He's serving the people, right? He's this aristocrat who's willing to step up to the plate and serve the common good. I think that's how a lot of people viewed FDR. I sort of call him Thurston Howell III, with some interesting similarities there, with a heart, right? Or at least people thought of him that way. He's an aristocrat. He's very charming. He's very warm. He's reassuring rhetoric. He's very different than Trump in a lot of interesting ways. Trump has his own appeal, but Trump will go out he just did it the other day. He'll say, get that guy off the air, get the FCC to get that guy off the air. Trump will name names and he'll make threats and he'll just say all this. He's like a bull in a china shop. And that's one of the good things about Trump, I think, is that he outs himself so much that he undermines himself sometimes. Like, Jimmy Kimmel is still on the air, right? Partly because of that. FDR is the kind of guy that would go behind the scenes. In fact, that's what he did. Every radio commentator who is anti-FDR is off the air, off network radio. Network, they're smaller fry. Off the network radio by 1938. And that's because there are people like Bo Carter, and FDR will call up sponsors. No, he doesn't do it. He uses this as, say, in The Godfather, buffers. He'll find people to call up the sponsors or call up the, network. He will order investigations. He did for Carter of his taxes and of his immigration status and so forth. But this is all done quietly. If you were to have asked FDR publicly, do you think Bo Carter should be forced off the air? He would say, no, of course I don't think that. And it's very different. So if you look at his speeches, he doesn't, and this is one of his secrets, he doesn't attack people by name. He does sometimes, but not very often. It's more general. And some people said you could even enjoy being attacked by FDR because he does it with this kind of good humor, and he doesn't get specific. He could be that way, but in public he's not that way, and that's a secret. So that makes him seem above the fray. The aristocrat who's above the fray, who's serving the common people, who's very charming. You also got to recognize the press at that time is not as independent as it is now, in the sense that press conferences, those are controlled, totally controlled. They're not broadcast. FDR will take the questions he wants to take. He controls them, and that's not just true of him. That remains the case till, I guess, Eisenhower is the first one that started to have, maybe Truman at the end, but I think Eisenhower definitely had public press conferences.
Okay, so one thing you said, the thing about him working behind the scenes to get people off the air, that makes me wonder. Then I get the impression that, because you had this Father Coughlin, right? And he said all these anti-Semitic things, and he all these things against the Jews, and he tried to push the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and he did all these things. But it seems like he still had like 40 million listeners. Seems like what took him down was he started opposing FDR, right?
Well, it's an interesting story there. Coughlin was still was FDR sort of helped, I don't know, give public publicity to Coughlin. He was kind of a fan. He would listen to him. Coughlin was on the air at the time of the 1932 campaign.
So was it like Trump and Tucker Carlson?
Yeah, it was a very close, friendly relationship. In some ways, I think that's not a bad comparison. And tensions start setting in by about 1935. Now, of course, the anti-Semitic stuff really comes later. I mean, that becomes kind of explicit by about really after Kristallnacht in a big way. And that's, that's later, it's 39 or 38, 39. You start to see that really become apparent. And FDR and Coughlin are there's some tension, but they remain certainly on speaking terms in late 1935. In fact, FDR was very worried that Coughlin was going to link up with Huey Long and they were going to get together. So he invited Coughlin to Hyde Park. And the guy that kind of was with them was Joseph Kennedy. And they were all three of them were at Hyde Park. And right before, when Coughlin was sleeping on the train on his way to Hyde Park, Huey Long died. So Coughlin found out about, that's Coughlin. So when he got off the train, he saw the newspapers that Huey Long had died. He'd been shot and then he lingered for a while. And so it was Coughlin who told FDR as he came down for breakfast that Huey Long had died. So this is as late as 1935. FDR is trying to schmooze him, but there's some increasing tension, and they do break. Coughlin is not a network radio guy. He is initially. I think he's on CBS like in 1931, but then they force him off. So he's very interesting, and he sets up kind of in these smaller stations, and he pays for his own time, right? So you got these smaller mom and pop stations. They need the money, and Coughlin so he sets up these national hookups. Well, he records a lot of his speeches, and then the stations will play the speeches, and he'll pay them. So he eventually is sort of indirectly forced off the air, and I think the administration is cheering this on when really with the encouragement of the administration, the broadcasters set up their own broadcasting code, which essentially prohibits attacks on another person's religion. But it also, what it does is it sort of prohibits people from buying time. In fact, that's the main thing it does. People with an axe to grind buying time. And that's one of the ways that Coughlin had been able to keep going. And that actually gets a lot of people in trouble, including labor unions and things, who, want to, or groups for or against involvement in World War II. They find it very difficult to say buy like a half hour and make a broadcast, because you have sort of an early version of the equal time rule coming in, where the broadcasters sort of prohibit that because then they might be forced to give equal time and all that. So it's very complicated. But Coughlin's star has really started to fall by about 36, 37 or so. It's a complicated story, but FDR definitely wants him off the air, but it's done more, through these indirect methods.
John?
Yeah, so
they remain on friendly terms for a much longer time than people have often think. I mean, 35 is pretty late. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there is a chapter in your book titled the politics of retaliation. Political retaliation is a topic that has been talked a lot about in recent years. And you touched on it here in regard to the media. But, what are some of the most egregious examples you think, of FDR going after political opponents, using the weight of the administration to do that?
I would say two things. One is if you're talking about in peacetime, right? The Black Committee. And this is a committee chaired by my fellow Alabamian, Hugo Black, Senator Hugo Black, law school sort of named after him here. And he was a senator, from Alabama, very, very pro New Deal, kind of a populist New Dealer type, and kind of an attack dog for the administration. Black's son once said that father, or Roosevelt's son once said that father told me that if he wanted something done, he'd go to Hugo Black. He'd go to him first. So he goes to Black to chair a committee, a Senate committee, to investigate lobbies. And how do they define lobbies? How did the committee define lobbying? Any attempt to basically influence legislation, indirect or direct. So arguably this discussion we're having could qualify. Just about anything could qualify. So what the committee does is Black is having difficulties bringing all these anti-New Deal people in and other business executives and so forth, and he's not getting what he wants out of them. So he sets out to get their private telegrams. He goes to the FCC, because there used to be a rule that all private telegrams, you had to keep copies of all private telegrams, right? So Black gets on the idea, let's say I bring these witnesses in, and I can get access to their private telegrams. That is the equivalent today of getting access to somebody's emails and texts. That is over 50% of long distance communication is from private telegrams. They're in many cases almost instantaneous. You say things in private telegrams that you would not say in letters, right? You let your hair down, all right? So he goes to the leading telegraph companies and says, he goes to Western Union, the leading one, says, I want all private telegrams sent to and from every single member of Congress for an 8-month period. Right? That's a lot, right? You know, people sending off a telegram to protest legislation or whatever. And what does Western Union say? They say, well, no, we won't do that. Our customers wouldn't like that. So Black goes to the FCC, and they are ordered to, and again, the administration is, approving all this. So they are ordered to provide access. So Black's committee staffers go down to Western Union, and they go through big boxes of copies of telegrams sent in 1935 for about an 8-month period. And they go through them one by one. And Black, it tells them, well, if you see anything of a private nature, just look past that. But if you see anything relating to legislation, and that would be influencing ideas, whatever, then copy that, note that. That's what they do. So how many telegrams did they go through? Several million. I mean, that they went through thousands a day, millions of private telegrams. And then they would ambush witnesses. There was major pushback once this was revealed. This was all done secretively. But Western Union started eventually to let people, because they were getting alarmed, because the search expanded to other cities besides Washington. They would target specific law firms and media people in like Idaho and stuff, right? And so they started to let people know that the Black Committee is searching for your telegrams. And one person who found out about this was Senator, well, I don't know if he was a senator. His name was Newton Baker. He'd been Secretary of War. He was a prominent figure in the Democratic Party. He'd been mentioned as a possible presidential candidate. Baker was so upset when he found out about this. And Baker was kind of a mild-mannered, moderate type. He said that if I saw somebody lynching, a group of people lynching Senator Hugo Black, I would not join in the lynching, essentially, but I wouldn't stop somebody whose hand is on the rope. Right? It's like, whoa, and he was very upset. And the Black Committee was sued and lost. This was headline news, often forgotten by historians, strangely, but it was headline news, and was condemned by papers, mainstream papers like the Washington Post, New York Times, and so forth. And the Black Committee lost in court. However, they'd already gotten all their telegrams, And what the court said essentially is, well, we got to defer to Congress, so we can't really do anything about the ones you've taken, but don't do this anymore. So this was an important precedent, by the way, which may have put a break on later inquisitorial committees like the McCarthy committee, who would have loved to have searched telegrams or
Right.
tap phones, which is kind of the same thing, or at least, the same kind of, I don't know, legal standard, but we're prevented from doing that. But it's sort of forgotten. The Black committee sort of forgotten. Black ends up on the Supreme Court soon after. Why? Well, because he'd been a very loyal guy. Now, the guy that FDR offered to be on the Supreme Court before Black and turned him down was Senator Minton of Indiana. Senator Minton took over Black's committee when Black went to the court, and Minton did the same procedures, and he got so frustrated at one point that Minton proposed a bill, very Trumpian bill, to make it a felony for any newspaper to print an article known to be false, fake news. And he proposed this bill. Big difference with today, though. He was shouted down left and right. Everybody said no. And his bill never even got voted. I don't think it even made it out of committee. It was so unpopular on both the left and the right. However, I think that there's a very good chance that he was put up to this proposal by FDR, who often spoke in very similar terms about fake news, very similar to Trump. These reporters, they're told what to write, right? These are lies, and he would say things like that. And I'm for freedom of the press, but I'm not for that, right? I'm not for the right to print lies, that kind of thing.
Right. That's fascinating stuff for sure.
Yeah.
Thomas, did you have something you wanted to ask? Are you muted?
You're muted.
Sorry.
Right now.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Okay, so as regards now, as regards the internment camps you briefly brought up, what was FDR's role in that? What was his position on it? How did he respond to criticisms? Is there anything that comes out of that you think that the audience should know?
Yeah, I think one thing they should know is that the way that that's often treated, of course, no historians, well, maybe Michelle Malkin, if you want to call her a historian, a few others, but not many, will actually say that internment was a good thing. So that's, no one's going to stand up for it. However, what about FDR's role? Well, the standard argument you get are, well, there was sort of hysteria. And they'll quote Pohl and other sources. Polls taken before internment, by the way, say, this was hysteria, and they'll say things like he had other things to think about, and he just sort of went along with it. It's too bad he did that, but it's sort of understandable. If you actually look at the record, FDR had proposed interning all Japanese in Hawaii, Japanese Americans who met Japanese ships who had consorted with Japanese sailors or whatever, interning them in his words concentration camps. I think he said that in 1936. Wow. So FDR was inclined in that direction. In the 1920s, he had written editorials, op-eds for a Georgia paper. He was sort of briefly an op-ed columnist. He kind of wanted to keep doing that, but he couldn't get syndicated. But he would say things in there like, I think California's right to prevent Japanese Americans from owning land. I think it's right to prevent interracial marriage because you don't want to, you don't want that because it'll, create all sorts of problems, having people marry each other and so forth in different races. So he's saying stuff like that. So he's not that sympathetic figure. Of course, he's well known for doing ethnic jokes, including with the Japanese, mimicking their accents and so forth like that. So he's not somebody that's that tolerant. So I think he's inclined in that direction. One thing you need to understand too is that this is not the heat of the moment. Japanese internment doesn't occur until February. That's when the decision is made. Pearl Harbor was in December. What is the initial reaction of Americans, including in California? It's often, if you look at newspaper articles and stuff, they're saying things like, well, these are American citizens. If they're born here, we're going to show the Axis that we value individual rights and so forth. So FDR could have easily given one little speech, one little comment. And if there, to the extent there was hysteria, in mainly confined to California, even there, not as bad as people say, he could have calmed that down very quickly by reminding people about the 4 freedoms. He'd just given that speech a few months earlier and saying, we value that so much, we're going to protect these people. So he is so enthusiastic about Japanese internment that he wants to do it in Hawaii. After he signs his order, he kept the order open-ended, Executive Order 8066, I think. He kept it open-ended. And he said, because I want the option of interning them in Hawaii. Well, that's 1/3 of the Hawaiian population. How is he going to do that? Well, what his plan was there was some island, I forget which one it was, one of the Hawaiian islands, one of the smaller ones. And he was going to put them, transport them there and keep them in camps. But then the commander on the ground, and this shows that he had a lot of pushback. And one guy that pushed back was the commander on the ground in Hawaii, who just sort of didn't like the idea, but also used kind of bureaucratic red tape, slowed things down, and ultimately they decided not to. Part of the reason is you have battles like Midway coming up in a while, and you need transport ships. What are you going to use transport ships for this purpose when you badly need them in the Pacific? So he's for this, and he keeps them there longer than his own advisors are against it initially, including his own attorney general. But to the extent they're against it even more by 1944. But there's an election coming up, and FDR is quite clearly, I'm not going to let them out during an election, and he keeps them there after the 44 election. Got to remember, that's after the Japanese fought so bravely, Japanese Americans in Europe. After that was getting a lot of good publicity for them and their, and so forth. That was a perfect time to do that. But he kept them there till after the election. So not a very, very pretty picture. And again, all kinds of people are against it. Attorney General Biddle is against it. Secretary of Interior Ickes, where a lot of these camps were built on interior land. FDR, FBI Director Hoover. These are the people that were against it, among others. So there is no groundswell forcing him to do this. He could have stopped that, and he could have just given some comments if he was worried about problems. Hey, we believe in, whatever. And they were monitoring Japanese aliens and things like that, like Germans and Italians. They could have just done that. Right? You didn't put Joe DiMaggio's, or his parents, well, I guess they talked about DiMaggio, but you didn't put Joe DiMaggio or Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin in camps, right? It wasn't the same thing.
Yeah, they had you think you have General Eisenhower, you have I think there's General Kramer, there was quite a few Germans that were heavily involved even in the Allied efforts. I wonder, this kind of reminds me of the situation, that story of Joseph Stalin, how people in the gulags, people would write letters to Joseph Stalin saying, Uncle Joe, you won't believe where they sent somebody in my family. And it's like Joseph Stalin's the one who ordered it, right? It's like, I imagine people are like, oh, FDR, please stop these people from doing this. And it's like, no, it sounds to me like FDR was really like the number one person behind all that then. What do you say?
Yeah, and this is an FDR, but it's so much. It's well, people really believe they can go to FDR and get him to relent. And one guy who believes that is Walter White, not the guy in Breaking Bad,
Not
but
Breaking
the
Bad.
head of the NAACP. And Walter White just keeps going back to FDR every year, on the anti-lynching bill, and just keeps hoping. And one time he says, "I am not going to speak to anybody in your administration anymore. I'm done with this." A few months later, he's trying again. And FDR puts him off. In the way he puts him off is he uses Eleanor. And Eleanor will go to the person, wants the anti-lynching bill, and will say, well, we can't do it now. We got all this other legislation, but maybe next year. I think next year we can do something. Or maybe we could do a general conference on law and order and bring lynching into that. And over again. Now, contrast FDR to President Harding and Coolidge. They came out openly for the anti-lynching bill, which under Harding, in fact, passed the House. FDR never takes a position on it. But anyway, that's sort of an example of that. You get it later. A. Philip Randolph, the very famous labor leader, goes to Memphis, where there are these African Americans, including African American Republicans, that are just being, summarily have searched. Their customers are being searched. They're being targeted in just blatant ways. And Randolph goes to his friend Eleanor and says, "Could you please take this to your husband? What's going on here?" And she wrote back and said, "Well, he just says, it's better. The timing is not good on this." And so nothing happens. So you get those examples where people, if only the king knew kind of thing. You go to FDR. And I would say in some ways, Wilson is actually more tolerant kind of fellow than FDR in this regard.
Wow.
Because,
he showed that Klan video in the White House and everything.
Well, he did, but Wilson will say things like, a publisher, the Nation magazine is like, there's a big crackdown, it's censored. It's a kind of a liberal magazine during World War I. And Wilson will say, right to his attorney general, like, well, do we really have to do this? Do we have to really do this? And his attorney general would say, yes, I want to do this. And Wilson will defer to him. Roosevelt, on the other hand, is often calling people subordinates like his attorney general and pushing them to go much further than they want to go. Roosevelt wants to prosecute publishers of what he calls the McCormick-Patterson Axis. These are newspapers that they're owned by the intermingled McCormick and Patterson family. The Chicago Tribune, the Washington, I forget which one it is. Washington Herald, I think, the New York Daily News. And these are big papers, millions of subscribers. They had opposed his pre-war policies. However, after Pearl Harbor came out very solidly for the war effort, and FDR wants to go after them. And Biddle basically says to him, look, I don't have a case against these people. They had a right to oppose the war. Once the war happened, they're totally on board. They're not trying to undermine the war effort. Very different than World War I, where a lot of people were trying to undermine the war effort. But FDR still wants to go after them. So it's kind of where he's pushing people to go further than they would want to go. And Wilson, sometimes it's the opposite, but he's deferential. He's got some very intolerant people, and he'll just sort of back them up. I'm not saying Wilson is any great tolerant guy. Because he brings in Jim Crow to Washington, segregation into Washington. It had not previously been there. And FDR is involved in that too, by the way, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
So you say that Truman was much better than FDR with civil rights. Maybe that probably had something to do with the war, probably changed people's mentality.
I say Truman or I say Wilson?
No, but Truman is a little bit better about civil rights.
Truman was against Japanese internment. He said in a 1961 interview, he said, I was against it then, and I was against it later, and I said so. I think he said he said so. There's no evidence that I've seen that he said so. He maybe did. But the Senate had a crucial vote on this. They had a chance to vote on this, funding for internment. And the only guy that said anything negative about it was Taft. Even Taft said, this is the worst bill I've ever seen. It was sloppily written, but even Taft said, well, I know what you're talking about in this bill. And, we got an emergency, so I'm not going to fight it. But Truman could have spoken up at that point. He was in the U.S. Senate. He did. But he said he was against it. He said he was very strong condemnation of it. And there were other senators like that, like his friend Burton Wheeler said he had actually, campaigned against it privately. Again, Wheeler didn't say anything either, though. But still, I think that they probably, I think they probably didn't like it.
It's also my understanding that the civil rights stuff begins with like Truman, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I don't think, Roosevelt is, got his finger to the political winds, and but I don't think it's likely that he would have integrated the military. Of course, that took time. A lot of people forget. You still had de facto kind of segregation in the military really until Eisenhower. Eisenhower's the guy that really brought in, the desegregation in a true way, desegregating army units in a serious way. But Truman got the ball rolling, and I think Truman's civil rights record was certainly much better than FDR. Truman was very upset. There were stories of brutality that came out. They were there before too, reported on before. But he took a lot of these stories of black soldiers coming home. One guy was blinded, for example, and I think he took this stuff seriously. I think he was, you could get to Truman on a kind of emotional level. More so than I think you could get to FDR. The FDR there was a coldness to FDR, calculated nature that I don't think you see as much with Truman.
Well, David, we would love to talk to you about this much longer, but we have about hit our time limit. So I wanted to thank you for this great conversation. We really appreciated you coming on the podcast. And again, the book is called, for those interested in reading it, this will give them some David we just barely scratched the surface on this. So FDR, A New Political Life. People can order it wherever books are sold. And David, we wish you a lot of success with it.
Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We had a great time. And for everybody else, if you watch today's episode on YouTube, as always, make sure you like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you are listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or some other audio platform, make sure you like and subscribe as well. And we will see you all next time on the Reagan Caucus Podcast.